e formação de recursos especializados. A construção de uma necessária expertise numa realidade que está sempre em constante dinâmica, como vemos com o caso da taxonomia. Isto aliado à revisão dos modelos de negócio, de gestão de riscos e de governo interno. A complexidade desta temática aumenta ainda mais em resultado da menor clareza de algumas normas que só a Comissão Europeia tem as competências para interpretar. A adoção de entendimentos distintos que temos vindo a ver surgir por outros reguladores, o limitado período de tempo que está a suceder entre a aprovação dos atos e a aplicação dos mesmos, dando um muito pouco espaço para este período transitório de adaptação, e também não existir uma perfeita consistência e articulação entre as diversas peças normativas, o que levanta muitas dificuldades. Consciente destes desafios, a CMVM continua a trabalhar num conjunto de recomendações para entidades supervisionadas, de forma a apoiar a indústria com maior certeza regulatória e transparência quanto às nossas expectativas como supervisor, mas ao mesmo tempo evitando trazer soluções que gerem mais peso regulatório desnecessário e ineficiente e, ao mesmo tempo, o que favoreça a convergência de supervisão. O que lhes posso dizer que nem sempre é um balanço muito fácil de alcançar. Em segundo lugar, gostava de referir que o combate aos comportamentos de ESG washing está no centro das preocupações dos reguladores, é um dos maiores riscos que o nosso mercado enfrenta e nós precisamos ter um mercado credível em que os investidores tenham confiança para celebrar para investir. Como sabem, ainda, por exemplo, nesta matéria, ainda nos últimos dias veio a lume que o supervisor americano e alemão está a questionar a gestora de ativos do Deutsche Bank sobre a sustentabilidade, a efetiva sustentabilidade dos fundos que comercializa. Em terceiro lugar, eu entendo que é urgente tomar medidas relativas aos prestadores de serviços de rating e de ESG ratings e de dados. Estes têm vindo a ter uma importância crescente e uma influência muito grande no mercado. E esta atividade tem sido identificada como comportando riscos. Não há uma definição do que é um ESG rating, como falta de transparência das metodologias, como não há definição de formas de cálculos e identificam-se ainda riscos de conflitos de interesses, que temos de ser capazes de endereçar com muita celeridade. Em quarto lugar, creio que, e isto é muito importante, nos temos de focar numa abordagem que considere a perspectiva dos investidores. Em particular, dada a complexidade da regulação e dos temas envolvidos. Ou seja, é necessário que a informação seja comunicada aos investidores de forma simples, clara e comparável, e que eles possam compreender e que lhes seja efetivamente útil para as suas decisões de investimento. Eu, pessoalmente, tenho algum receio que estes templates e estes modelos que agora serão aprovados para explicar o conteúdo dos produtos seja e possa ser inteiramente compreensível pelos investidores, receio muito que não. Isto leva-nos a um quinto e enorme desafio, que tem a ver a necessidade de assegurar ao mercado e aos investidores o acesso à informação empresarial em matéria de sustentabilidade de melhor qualidade, de forma consistente e comparável. E isto é um desafio que temos de enfrentar a nível internacional. Nós vivemos num mercado global e o sucesso da transição para um modelo mais sustentável depende de uma abordagem concertada a nível internacional. Nós vemos que há muita informação de empresas sobre o clima. Há uma multiplicidade de standards, de princípios e de critérios de divulgação de informação não financeira. Isto traz enormes dificuldades, porque é muito difícil conseguir comparar ou ter consistência na informação empresarial que está a ser divulgada. Assim, é com grande entusiasmo que vimos surgir o projeto do IFRS Foundation de estabelecer um Sustainability Standards Board para desenvolver um único standard universal de reporte em matéria de clima. A IOSCO já se encontra a trabalhar com a IFRS Foundation neste projeto e este projeto viu recentemente ter o suporte expresso do Financial Stability Board e dos ministros das Finanças e governadores dos bancos centrais do G20. Temos a expectativa que estas normas climáticas universais possam ser emitidas em meados de 2022 e também temos muitas expectativas que a breve prazo essas normas evoluam de forma dinâmica para abraçar os outros tópicos da sustentabilidade para além do clima que não podem ser deixados para trás. Este será um importante marco para lidar com este grande desafio que temos pela frente. E eu entendo que é crucial que a Europa apoie convictamente as iniciativas internacionais nesta matéria. Como estarão certamente ao corrente, na Europa vigora um conceito de dupla materialidade no reporte de informação, o que significa que as empresas não só devem divulgar de que forma as questões de sustentabilidade afetam a sua performance, mas também o impacto que essas empresas têm nas pessoas e no meio ambiente. A adoção deste conceito de dupla materialidade, muito difícil, reunirá, pelo menos nesta fase inicial, consensos a nível internacional. Mas eu acho que importa assegurar que, pelo menos, os estándares europeus que estão a ser desenvolvidos não entrarão em conflito com este standard único a ser adotado a nível global. Por último, não poderia deixar uma nota sobre a importância da taxonomia como instrumento para fomentar a transição para uma economia verde e mais sustentável e inclusiva, e para reforçar a credibilidade do mercado e do financiamento sustentável. E mais uma vez reforço que isto é importante, um projeto a nível europeu, mas nós temos de trazer isto para o plano internacional. E, portanto, a Europa efetivamente tem liderado nesta matéria, mas importa conseguir trazer as outras regiões do mundo, nomeadamente que são muito, ou seja, que a cota para a parte ambiental é muito significativa, dizendo que a Europa, apenas 8% das emissões de dióxido de carbono vêm da Europa. Portanto, isto é um projeto que não pode ser um projeto europeu, tem de ser um projeto a nível global. E como tal, também acho que é de louvar os esforços que já estão a ser desenvolvidos pelo International Platform on Sustainable Finance, por um lado, e pelo Grupo das Finanças Sustentáveis do G20, que estão já a trabalhar para alcançar uma maior convergência e compatibilização da taxonomia ao nível global. Agradeço a vossa atenção e espero que o meu contributo possa ser de utilidade. Obrigada.
Thank you very much. Listening to Rita reminded me of all the challenging times and the diversity of topics that CMVM addresses and the ongoing challenges that regulators face. The next speakers, I think, will be online, isn't it? So they are from the CFA Institute. I have to check their names here. I'm really sorry. So it's Klaus Peisler and Julia Orlik. I hope I pronounced them correctly. So Klaus currently serves as a Senior Director of Institutional Relations for EMEA region, and Julia serves as Director of Institutional Relations for EMEA region. Klaus has previously worked at the Millennium Global Group and also for many years at the Russell Investments, and is a CFA charter holder. Julia actually joined CFA Institute just right after after university, after she graduated, and she holds the CFA Institute certificate in ESG investing. I think Oh, they're already connected. Oh, so, so a round of applause for Klaus and for Julia.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Let me just share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay. There we go. I hope everyone can see that. It worked well in our rehearsal, so I hope it works well now. So yeah, let's dive right in. So Klaus and I will talk you through. Did someone? No, I think we're good. Okay. I just thought someone struggled hearing us, but I think we're good. So Klaus and I are going to talk about two topics today. One of them is the future of sustainability in investment management, which is CFA Institute's latest big ESG-focused research report, which was published in late 2020. And then we're also going to spend a few minutes talking about the latest CFA Institute qualification, which is the CFA Institute Certificate in ESG Investing. And naturally, we only have about 20 minutes together, so we can only touch on the highlights of this report. But of course, the full report is online, so we encourage you to go online and have a look and read through it after the session today. So to set the scene a little bit, CFA Institute has, of course, been a thought leader in terms of research for a long time, and our industry research and advocacy team continue to work on and publish research reports and publications on various topics. And of course, ESG and sustainability has been a big topic for the last couple of years and a big focus area. The reason this report was published and worked on last year was really because we feel like now sustainable investing is in the balance. It's at a moment of balance and suspension, balance between the consideration of financial and non-financial factors, balance between the short term and the long term, and also balance between the interests of many different stakeholders. But even though sustainable investing is still hanging in this moment of balance, the report finds that what we now call sustainable investing has already gone further than anything we may have called sustainable investing before in various manners. So sustainable investing now is actually additive to investment theory. It's complementary. It actually shows and provides insights into how value can be created by taking ESG consideration into account, and it considers the interests of many stakeholders. Now, this report we're talking about today is the fourth in a series of reports, all looking at the future of our industry. This is all under the Future of Finance umbrella at CFA Institute. So this series started in 2017, and the reports first looked at the future state of the investment profession as a whole, then at the investment firm of the future, the investment professional of the future, and now at the future of sustainability in investment management, which of course touches all of those, the profession, the firm, and professionals alike. So this report is split into four main sections: influencers, drivers, enablers, and actions. And fittingly, they form the acronym IDEA. And you may have spotted on the cover slide, the subtitle of the report is From Ideas to Reality, because that's where we feel sustainable investing and ESG investing sits right now. It's moving very rapidly from ideas to a very real reality. And the time frame we're looking at in this report is the next 5 to 10 years. And the reason 5 to 10 years have been chosen is because it is really far enough ahead for industry leaders to plan strategically for all these changes that the report outlines. But it's also not so far ahead that it seems simply too distant worth thinking about. That's enough context. Let's dive straight in and start with influences. So this section of the report really looks at how have we come where we are now in our sustainability journey and sustainable investing journey? Where might we be going? What are some future scenarios, basically, where our sustainability journey could take us as an industry? Two of the highlights from this section. Number one is, of course, the significant growth in ESG investing in the last 3 years. So the numbers you see on the slide here are from a survey we did with CFA Institute members last year, which served as one of the key sources of intelligence for this report. And 85% of the CFA Institute members surveyed stated that they now take either E, S, and or G factors into account in their investment decisions. And this is up from only 73% when we asked this question in a survey in 2017. So there has been significant growth in those 3 years. The factor that has experienced the most growth were environmental factors, and that's perhaps unsurprising given climate, biodiversity have of course been key topics in the last couple of years and continue to be so, with COP26 being around the corner and the recent UN report on climate change. But I think it would also be very interesting to ask this question again now and see what has happened to the social factors, given that the COVID pandemic has, of course, massively accelerated the importance and the rise of social factors and how we look at them. Another question we have asked in the influencers section, we have asked firms why they actually consider ESG factors and why they're focusing on ESG investing. And the top reasons here remain pretty unchanged from 2017. It's mainly to help manage investment risks or because clients demand it. And that client demand was specifically strong in the Americas region, whereas in EMEA, firms were much more likely to state reasons such as they consider it a fiduciary duty to look at ESG factors. They see focusing on ESG as a positive reputational benefit for their firm, or of course also regulatory requirements, which given that the EU is certainly a world leader in ESG regulations, that wasn't a surprise either, that was very important for EMEA-based firms. So with that, Klaus, over to you for the next section. You just guide me through the slides.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, and appreciate the time to be able to speak on this. So really, what is driving ESG investments? I think a lot of this may seem intuitive, but interestingly enough, what we're finding is the actual actions of investment management and the investment management industry is differing from the actual desire for ESG investments. So who is pushing? Who is driving this? And we feel that the asset owners, be it individual retail investors or institutional investors, are having a great effect on how ESG moves in the future. If you can go to the next slide, Julia. So this one is very, very interesting. And really what it focuses on is you'll see an incredible gap between what, especially on the retail side, what that means is individual investors are currently employing ESG strategies versus what the market is actually doing. So you see on the right side is the investors interested by age versus on the left side is what they're currently employing. Also, interestingly enough, we see the younger gap is a little bit higher than in the older gap, which really shows that the millennial attitude toward ESG and sustainable investing is actually quite important. And that's something that we increasingly need to focus on. One part of this is that the older generations have a lot of wealth that they are now either utilizing or spending for their retirement. The younger generation is putting these assets into play and are increasingly looking at ESG, thematic, sustainable investing to put those funds to work, not only just with an ESG theme, but also looking for the fact that ESG can actually add to investment returns and add to potential alpha. If you don't mind, Julia, to the next slide. This one is actually very, very quite interesting, that it also shows not only the difference between institutional and retail, but also a bit of an age gap as well. So if you see the difference between institutional and retail, what describes the interest, the higher risk-adjusted returns, where we expect returns to happen in this survey was higher on the institutional side than the retail side, which actually leads to the attitude of, on the retail side, the actual individual investors are more concerned about their personal views toward ESG rather than any return-seeking profile. But interestingly enough, when we look at the different age gaps, that also shifts the model. When you look at the younger generation, expecting the ESG to add to returns in the 25 up to the 44 age generation, interestingly enough, those are looking at higher risk adjusted returns. But that in fact also goes into the institutional, or those that are investing into their company pensions, their personal pensions, looking for these longer term returns for their retirement, etc. But in essence, what this is also showing is no matter what, ESG is a very significant importance to a lot of investors, be it personal or institutional. One thing that's also interesting when it comes out in these surveys is the fact of, if you look at this aspect of the universal owner, and those that tend to be at the older generation have their assets throughout the market, are very, very widespread, are considered this universal owner, where they own all parts of the asset class. What that is interesting about is that the fact that ESG affects all aspects of asset classes and all aspects of investment. So it's not only what is in the individual securities, but climate change, for example, is going to affect the market as a whole. So it may be a personal view, but also they want to be more positive on the market, but they know it's going to affect their investments as a whole. So it's definitely going to have an effect on the entire investment community. But again, the millennial generation tends to have a stronger, more vocal view, and that needs to be taken into account when looking at the investment community. If we look at the next section, the E in the idea, this is really on how the investment industry is going to take these into account, and how investment professionals are going to factor into ESG investing, the operational models and the people models. Where's the resource going to come? How do we need to be educated to move ESG, not only currently, but into the world moving forward? So perhaps if we can go to the next slide. The statistics again and the research are very, very interesting. A dramatic change in the last couple of years is, what is a commitment to ESG? What is a commitment to my staff in ESG? And you can see it's a dramatically increase from 2018, only a 2-year difference, where it says, I expect my firm's commitment to research is from 20% to 55%, a massive, massive difference. And even if you look at on the slightly higher range from 52 to 35, although that is smaller, between significantly higher and slightly higher, there is a dramatic shift. So ESG is clearly taking into effect not only into firms' interests, but individual employees and the desire to move more into ESG in the next couple of years. So how is this going to be addressed? How do we move to getting more employer education, to more firm education in ESG? And can we move to the next slide? So where is there a need for improved standards? Do we use analysis, etc.? So obviously 73% assume that ESG has an effect on the firm's cost of capital. Do firms use ESG? These are all the effects that are important. The greenwashing is very, very interesting aspect that has come into play. If you look at the left slide, the left graphic, do you think there's a need for improved standards? This is one aspect that the CFA Institute in particular and the global regulators are taking into account. Perhaps you have seen the news on massive investment firms such as DWS that came into the news about their effect of greenwashing and how that's unacceptable for a lot of regulators, for a lot of markets. So this is becoming very, very important. So how do we ensure that firms are not doing this greenwashing? How do we prove, in essence, that employers and firms are actually true ESG practitioners. This is a very, very important aspect, and that's something that we feel that the CFA Institute can help in the marketplace to help ensure that ESG is properly incorporated into the employer's work. Perhaps we can go to the next slide very, very briefly. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is a very interesting slide, an interesting statistic on the actual employees and the skills within the different roles that we see dealing around ESG. The profiles on LinkedIn, the leftmost column on here shows what profiles on LinkedIn show that they have ESG expertise and where the demand is. The profiles on LinkedIn you can see very highly on financial advisor, portfolio manager, analyst, but you can see those that have these sustainability skills or listed as such are very, very low. The growth is very, very important, and those number of postings seeking this ESG expertise is increasing rather dramatically, specifically on the portfolio manager, the CIO, financial advisor side of the business. So how can we address this? Well, one of the ways is around ESG training. So not only will that help close this gap between what is currently in the skill set to what the growth is looking for and the expertise is looking for, but what firms are willing to offer and firms are willing to demonstrate as ESG expertise. If we go very briefly to the next slide, to finish off this section, this is very interesting, as we can see there's a global trend, and not only the global trend, but it's pretty even across the globe into those that really look at planning to pursue the training in over the next few years. Already proficient is relatively low. Those getting training is still relatively low. What's very important here is the right-hand column. Those that have no interest in ESG is incredibly low. And we understand that because clearly the marketplace is demanding this. Clearly the retail sector and the younger generation whose assets and finances are being put to work have a strong interest in ESG. But in order to meet that need, training is clearly desired, and training is clearly taking place and going to increase over the next few years. We're going to shortly discuss our ESG certification going forward, but in summary on this, clearly there's a need and desire not only for firms to demonstrate their commitment to ESG, but clearly there's a gap between what they're able to offer and what the market desires. And we are going to work with firms such as CFA Portugal and other firms within your region to help try to close that gap, to bring ESG into the mainstream of an investment concept. I'll turn it back over to Julia now.
Great, thank you, Klaus. Perfect segue into the final section of this report about actions. So what was very important for this report was not only to share some interesting insights and some interesting data, but also to provide some resources for both individual investment professionals, but also for organizations as a whole to help them fill these gaps that Klaus has just mentioned and help them continue, advance and progress towards their sustainability journey. So to that end, what our research team has created in addition to this report is a sustainability rubric. So you may not be familiar with the term rubric. I certainly wasn't when I heard it for the first time. So this actually comes from the education sector. A rubric usually describes basically an assessment tool to assess a student's progress and proficiency in a certain topic and then provide feedback to fill any gaps there may be. So we have created a rubric around sustainability, which is actually a roughly 20 question long online questionnaire. It's online. We will share the link certainly later. But what you can do is you can fill in this questionnaire, which tackles all different areas of sustainability. There is one version for you to do as an individual, and there's one version to do either to do for yourself or by yourself or with colleagues. on behalf of your organization to see where does your firm sit in its sustainability journey. And when you finished filling in this rubric, you will get results, you will get an assessment where you as a professional, as an individual, or your firm as an organization currently are. Are you still at the beginning of your sustainability journey, or are you already quite far advanced? As well as suggestion of resources, what you or your organization can do to fill any gaps there may be. So educational resources, both from CFA Institute and also from other organizations. So what the rubric covers, it really looks at six topic areas, 6 areas of sustainability, which you can see here on the slide. The first one, of course, Klaus already talked about this in the last session, and the last section is ESG education. And as Klaus has mentioned, ESG education and the level of education is still very uneven across organizations and across different regions and countries. But luckily, the vast majority of firms are planning on providing ESG education and training to their employees in the near future if they are not already doing so, which is very encouraging. And of course, CFA Institute wants to play a central role in that. The second aspect of the rubric is about system level thinking. So this is really all about this considering the wider system, thinking about how your investment decision could have a ripple effect that may affect all sorts of stakeholders that we wouldn't necessarily consider otherwise. And such as sustainability and ESG should be in general, the system level thinking is really meant to be additive to traditional investment thinking. The third part of the rubric is about collaboration synergy. So whilst there has been some great work done on sustainable investing in the last couple of years, the level of collaboration between organizations or even within an organization are often still quite low. It's still quite siloed. And these silos need to be broken up, and collaboration needs to really flourish for sustainability to maintain its momentum going forward. ESG data, Klaus already talked about that as well a little bit. I mean, I'm sure there's no ESG event these days where data isn't mentioned at some point. And of course, ESG data at the moment is still partly part of a sustainability problem, but it really needs to move towards being part of the sustainability solution. Sustainability innovation, quite self-explanatory, is the 5th section. Of course, there has been some great innovative work done in ESG and sustainability, but sustainability innovation still tends to be quite slow and often quite narrow as well. So again, silos need to be broken up there, and everything needs to be accelerated to maintain momentum and increase engagement. And then last but not least, the 6th section looks at purposeful culture. That is very much towards organizations, of course, that organizations really have this this enlightened self-interest at their core, where they realize that sustainability and ESG is really a win-win situation, both for the organization as well as for their clients and all other stakeholders involved. Now, finally, Klaus already alluded to this. This is really where CFA Institute sits across the ESG value chain. So with all our efforts in research, in advocacy, standard setting, of course, and then education, we really touch all these pieces, the issuers, analysts, the portfolios, and we try to add value across the entire chain, ultimately, of course, for the benefit of the end client. And then finally, here, I already mentioned this, we are, of course, happy for these slides to be distributed after our talk. And here's the direct link to the sustainability rubric. So when you receive the slides later, you can either click on the link or scan the QR code if you want to have a look at the rubric and the report yourselves. So over to you, Klaus, for the final section.
Thank you, Julia. Very, very important information. And I will be brief in the interest of time, but speaking of the education aspect, how can a firm and how can an individual employee help to demonstrate their commitment to ESG and demonstrate to the market as a whole of their ESG education and knowledge? Well, we provide from the CFA Institute the certificate in ESG investing that many of you may have heard of already, but if not, we're going to go over this very, very briefly. So what we offer, Julia, if you could go to the next slide, is the Certificate of ESG Investing. Obviously, for those of you that know, because of the CFA Institute of Portugal and other programs, we are a market leader in certifications and charters and investment education. And we have recently taken over what is considered one of the leading ESG investment certification skills to help provide an education and a certification to help demonstrate strong ESG knowledge for both individuals and their firms. If we can go to the next slide. What our certificate is, it's created by practitioners for those that have practiced ESG in their working environment and those that support ESG to provide those knowledge and skills in not only ESG investing, but how to apply those terms and those practices into your day-to-day market analysis, portfolio analysis, and demonstration to the greater firm. The program itself is a self-paced study, as are other CFA Institute programs, but this one is slightly different. It's a one-year program, or a one exam program, I should say. The recommended study is on average 130 hours, but can be slightly less depending on your knowledge and your experience in both investment and ESG. And the difference as well is there are no formal requirements. So what this means that opens it up to a greater variety of careers and jobs of those that would be potentially interested in signing up and taking this. Very, very important for both a firm and an individual employee is that this is endorsed by the UNPRI, which a significant number of firms and asset owners across the world are signatories to, and is obviously a very important thing in the global marketplace to promote. And we are very thrilled that the UNPRI supports and endorses our certification. The exam itself is 2 hours and 20 minutes with 100 questions. It's a multiple choice item set, and it is done online. One of the advantages as well with the certificate and the exam itself is that can be done at a test center, or actually even at your own home, where you can do it in a private place with an office setting that is reviewed and proctored by individuals, but that is very independent and allows a lot of flexibility to take this exam. It says, and the statistic is actually old by now, but over 10,000 registrations since the UK, CFA Society of the UK launched this in 2009. And we're seeing significant growth and interest in this to become a standard for ESG qualifications and certifications. If you can go to the next slide, Julia. Importantly, one of the things that is great about this ESG certification, and it sets it apart from some of the others, is that it's designed a lot more broadly than perhaps some of the other investment certifications in the market. Versus some are designed more so for portfolio managers and analysts, because ESG is such a broad topic among asset managers, investment managers, asset owners, and other firms. This certification is designed for not only portfolio managers, but sales and distribution teams, business growth, product development, compliance, legal, etc., and those client-facing or those that need to know how ESG is impacted in the greater marketplace. So it doesn't delve as deep into certain portfolio management analysis functions, rather it expands on the ESG marketplace itself and how to integrate that into investment management function. The next slide we see is the fact that this is becoming a very important, broad, accepted certification around the globe. It's becoming increasingly adopted in training and education lists for various large global industries. Some are actually mandating it for certain functions throughout their firms. And it's important to be able to promote the fact that their employees are trained and have certifications on ESG. On the right side here, you can see some of the major asset managers and in financial firms that have come out and promoted the fact that they are supporters of this ESG certification. And this list, in fact, is growing quite substantially every day on this one. So it's an important aspect to help firms promote their own employees when it comes to, say, RFPs or their graded marketplace, to say our employees and our firm are a supporter of ESG, and we have a certification to help demonstrate our knowledge in that. Very briefly, I'll finish off on what the ESG certification covers in terms of syllabus and the subject matter. It covers 9 chapters and 9 different sections. The first couple of them are really on the ESG marketplace, what it is, what it means in the greater asset management community, and then focusing 3 chapters, one on E, one on S, and one on G in particular. And the rest of the program is really on how to take these ESG factors and incorporate them in investment strategies, portfolio management, research, etc. And that's where the majority of the questions, as you can see, what's listed below, where that really takes into account is taking these aspects of ESG and applying them into portfolio management rather than just knowing what the individual strategies are about. So in the end, and I will finish up with this slide, is why do I want to bother? Why do I want to go through this? Obviously, the CFA Institute, as many of you know, is a recognized leader in investment education, ethics education, and qualifications. And we feel that our support and backing on an ESG certificate really helps demonstrate to the market the importance of ESG and the high qualifications one needs to demonstrate their own skills and abilities on that one. And it creates, very importantly, as Julia mentioned earlier in her presentation, a common language around ESG. One of the struggles that is around ESG, not only in research, not only in how it's described in the market, how research is, how data is that every firm or every data provider tends to see ESG in a different lens and what this all means. This provides a foundation to have a common language, a common understanding, and a common knowledge base around what is ESG in the market, and in essence can be proven by having a certificate demonstrating the knowledge around ESG. So again, the next slide really is just a way for you to go on to the website. We are both at the CFA Institute, and we're happy to take further questions and help guide you through that. But your associates at the CFA Society of Portugal are probably more than happy to help guide you through this. But we encourage and hope that we can provide more information and services around the ESG certificate. It's a very, very strong growing interest, not only in Europe, but globally, as a demonstration of ESG ability for individuals and firms themselves.
Thank you very much, Julia and Klaus. I think you have to look there for you to see me. It was a very interesting presentation. And I also encourage you to take the certificate. I think it's for the ones who want to pursue a career in ESG is definitely a good choice. Our next speaker is Juan Fierro. I think that's the way correctly pronounce it. He has over 15 years of experience in the asset management industry. He is currently the associate director for Iberia at Janus Anderson, covering the Iberia region. Previously, he also worked at New Star Asset Management, which was bought by Janus Anderson, and he started his career at Banco Banif. Is it the Portuguese Banco Banif? Previously. And he holds a degree in business administration from Universidade Autónoma, and we're very pleased to welcome to the stage.
So thank you, CFA. Society Portugal for inviting us and taking the opportunity to be here. And thank you everyone for joining today. And also, I guess it's nice to see that we are somehow recovering the normality after difficult months. So I'm going to speak about sustainability, as you can see on the title of the presentation. And one of the first things I want to address is the definition of sustainability. I think, obviously it's in the title of the presentation, as I said, so I think it's important to right up front, define or address what sustainability means. So what you can see on the first slide is the definition of sustainability according to the first report from the United Nations on Sustainability Development back in 1987. This report was called Our Common Future, or the Brundtland Report, in recognition to the role that the chair of the United Nations Commission on Development and Environment had, and that was at the prime, or the former Prime Minister of Norway. So basically the definition of sustainable development, as you can see, is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think this is quite relevant because today we have a moral obligation with future generations to make sure that we can continue to grow in a sustainable way. So on this first slide, I'm going to spend, the second slide, I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide because I think it's really important. If you will, this is your hook. This really sets the whole scene of how to speak about sustainability and sustainable investment, and it all starts with these 4 mega trends. Essentially, these 4 mega trends capture the sustainability problem. So population growth. Today's population growth in the world is around 7.9 billion people, and it's predicted to be 10 billion people in the next 30 to 35 years. So that's an amazing 25% increase in the population. There will be a need to satisfy the demand, not just from basic necessities, such as water, food, and shelter, but also other necessities, such as, for example, education, financial services. So the second mega trend, aging population, is probably a mega trend that we can consider separately. I mean, according to the United Nations, aging population is poised to become one of the greatest social transformations in society in the 21st century. By 2050, it is predicted that 1 in 6 people globally will be over the age of 65 years old. That's approximately 16% of the world population, and that's up from 1 in 11 or 9% back 2 years ago in 2019. Again, the implications of aging population go from, rising dependency ratios, declining workforce participation. They also include increasing in needs of financial services, healthcare services, but also includes, social security and social protection for those populations or for those people. Resources constraints. So due to population growth and the linear economic model that we are living in, basically natural capital resources are being damaged and depleted much faster than can be replenished. That means that basically the whole development is suffering to keep with the social trends that we're living in. And finally, probably not last or not least important, is climate change. As you all know, today's climate change is one of the greatest social and environmental problems that we are living or we're facing. These four environmental and social megatrends are putting the global economy under enormous pressure. And we believe they have a profound and far-reaching investment implications. That's really a key point. Failure to address these most urgent problems the world is facing will impact countries and sectors in some degree. Sustainable investment is not anymore a niche investment. It's no longer a mega trend. It is a need. There is a need to invest in companies that they have a positive impact on environment and society. There is a need investing in companies that they are providing solutions to the environmental and social challenges without damaging the natural capital. This also means that as investors, staying on the right side of disruption, this type of companies that do good and will provide investors a persistent source of return, deliver future compound growth, and also help mitigate downside risk. For those investors that they are not incentivized enough with this moral obligation that we have with future generations, and also with these profound implications that these mega trends are having on society and the environment, there are also other driving forces that explain the boom that we are seeing in investing and in sustainable investing. On the first one, as you can see, is the development in the international agenda. We all are very aware of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We all know the Paris Agreement, and we all also are familiar with TCFD. Also, second point is regional policy and regulatory changes. Again, we are all aware of all the changes that are taking place in Europe in terms of on the regulatory landscape. In the US, there's been a significant change in the policy and regulatory landscape under the previous administration with Donald Trump and the current administration with John Biden. In China, a bit of the same. We are seeing increasingly developments on the regulatory and policy level, particularly related to the commitments that the government is doing with carbon limitations and carbon neutrality, sorry, and limitation the emissions of CO2. And finally, consumer expectations. Obviously, we again know that the changes taking place in the consumer expectations and younger generation consumption patterns. Individuals are increasingly aware of sustainable consumption and give more importance to the social and environmental practices of companies and brands, not only at the product level and service level, but they are also putting more pressure on companies on the value chain, the production process. Also, they are increasingly looking at how are these relationships of the companies with all the stakeholders. The other day I was reading, actually, it's not only about consumption. The other day I read a survey by the Bentley University that found that a whopping 86% of millennials consider a priority to work for a business that conduct itself ethically and responsibly. In fact, most millennials will be willing to take a pay cut in order to work for these businesses. So we have seen, for different reasons, sustainable investment is a major force shaping global capital markets, and in turn is influencing companies and others seeking or competing for capital. According to the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance, in its 2020 annual review, sustainable investments reached over $35 trillion in major markets. That's US, Europe, Australasia, Japan, and Canada, having grown by 15% in the last couple of years, and in total equating approximately 35% of all professionally managed assets. But beyond these top-level numbers and these growth rates, there is a clear evidence that it is an industry or investment philosophy, the sustainable investment that is in transition, with rapid developments across regions that are resetting expectations and with an emphasis on moving towards best standards of practice. This trend on best standards of practice, you can see it on the screen on the evolution of the quality of the approaches to sustainable investing. The largest sustainable investing today globally is ESG integration, as shown in the chart. Is the blue bar at the bottom of the chart, with approximately $25 trillion in assets under management. ESG integration is followed by negative or exclusionary screening with approximately 15 trillion of US dollar, and corporate engagement and shareholder action with approximately 10 trillion. However, more importantly, and looking at the evolution, is looking at the evolution of the assets in the last few years. In the chart, again, you can see the green is 2016, light blue 2018, and dark blue 2020. And what we can see is that more sophisticated or advanced sustainable strategies, such as sustainable theme investing, corporate engagement and shareholder action, or ESG integration, have all experienced consistent growth during this year, between 2016 and 2020. And on the other hand, more simple or simple strategies like norm-based screening, positive screening, as well as negative screening, have all experienced a more variable trajectory since 2016. Actually, some of them, they have even declined the assets that they have. So now, when it comes to more sophisticated and advanced sustainable investment strategies, we think an active management approach is critical because it is through in-depth analysis and due diligence, engagement and proxy voting that managers can really identify companies that are more likely to succeed over the longer term. A passive allocation is a direct abdication of the ability as an investor or shareholder to make a conscious decision, a conscious decision about how capital is being allocated into the world. So that nicely leads me to the last part of my presentation, that is the importance of active management on sustainable investing. So an important reason for active management approach when it comes to sustainable investing is this. There is a lack of ESG standardization and data coverage across rating agencies. Moreover, company ratings are often either too simplistic or even disagree depending on the rating providers. So why is there such a dispersion among ESG providers? Well, I can think of at least 3 reasons. ESG, like the interpretation of company financial statements, can be subjective, and model or methodologies can vary. So ESG lacks definition, and it can often mean different things to different people. Often, ESG, as I said, are simplistic. ESG ratings or scorings are simplistic, in danger of over-relying on quantitative and readily available data. And additionally, they tend to look back, ignoring completely what the management team in the companies are planning to do in the future. And third, these scorings, normally, they ignore intangible aspects of a company. And a good example of that, it could be the culture of the company, something quite important. Having said all that, it's important to highlight as well that we are seeing an increasing effort to standardization of ESG reporting. We are also seeing a global convergence in ESG standards slowly emerging, and also we're seeing a growth in regional ESG regulation. All these things are essentially tackling the greenwashing, a problem that some of my colleagues mentioned in their speeches. By the way, at Janus Henderson, we obviously take into account rating agencies. We actually subscribe to some of those agencies like Sustainalytics, MSCI, DGO, but we do our own analysis. We go beyond these ratings and we focus more on the future plans of the company management teams, and obviously the ESG risk and opportunities looking at the future. So the second aspect I wanted to touch on the importance of active management is the active engagement and stewardship. I think many ESG strategies don't always translate into action, don't translate into action. In practice, some money managers might be aware of or take into account the ESG factors when making investment decisions, but they are not necessarily compelled to act on that information. In addition, many of the environmental and social goals that companies might have are aspirational. So in occasions, there is a very strong philosophy of improvement. That means that as an active managers or as an active investors, engaging and acting as partners with these companies is an essential aspect of driving progress. Strong ownership practices, such as active voting or active engagement within these companies, can help protect and enhance long-term shareholder value. On that screen, you can see some of the statistics. Like, for example, during 2020, we engaged with over 1,100 companies on ESG topics. On the right-hand side, again, we voted in over 400 and 319 company meetings. I'm not going to get into the details of that data, but you can imagine that most of that engagement and proxy voting last year were around, for example, on the S for social, was mainly on the impact of the pandemic on the workforce. It was also related to diversity, not just on gender, but also the racial diversity. On the E, the regular theme of discussion that we had with companies, it was directly investment related. It's important to highlight that one of the fastest growing subjects of engagement on environmental issues is around net zero carbon. Numerous companies across different sectors have begun to make net zero commitments by 2050 or even sooner. In many cases, these actions required to achieve net zero carbon and are not directly related or important to the company. They are not directly responsible for the companies. It will be also significant actions taken by suppliers, by customers, and ultimately even the regulators. Regarding proxy voting, as I said before, we voted again approximately 4,320 shareholder meetings in 2020. As in previous year, I think that's an important statistic. In Europe and in UK, executive compensation was again an issue on which we were most likely to vote against. The main reason were concerns over the misalignment between remuneration and company performance, or over the quantum of the payments relative to peers. In the US, on the other hand, director-related proposals were the most regular items on which we voted against board recommendations. In these instances, the most important rationale for the opposition was companies failing to meet market practice for good corporate governance and shareholders' rights. So the final point I'm going to make on the importance of active management is the transparency in reporting. Actually, I read recently that in a survey that one of the major concerns for investors this year and last year was related to sustainable investing was regulation and the transparency of reporting. I have put on the screen, in this case, the first one, an example of a reporting that we do for one of our flagship strategies, and it's the contribution of that portfolio to each and every single SDG that there is. And basically, obviously, it's a work that takes time, but I think we are committed with our investors and clients to make sure that they know how they're investing their money and the impact that they're having on the SDGs. The other example I put on the reporting was on TCFD. Again, it's a very detailed reporting on how the portfolio is contributing to the goals of the Paris Agreement. Again, I think this is a commitment that we have with our investors and clients to make sure that they understand how the portfolio is positioned. So finally, and to conclude my presentation, I just wanted to throw a couple of ideas to probably the more skeptical investors or the audience that is there in the room. This is from a Morningstar study, a recent study. Sustainable investing, as you know, enjoy a very strong 2020, but also longer-term figures are relatively attractive. This is important because the persistent perception that ESG-based investing requires a performance sacrifice. This, from the Morningstar report, as I said, I will highlight probably three conclusions. One, 88% of the ESG indices outperformed for the last 5 years through the end of 2020 to the equivalent indices. The second highlight that I will do is that 91% of the ESG indices lost less than their broad market indices during down markets over the past 5 years, including Q1 of 2020. And the one that I found more interesting is that ESG indices outperform not just because of the sector bias. They outperform also because of the security selection. So when you do the attribution of that analysis, you can see that it's not just the bias that these indices had to technology. It's also a security selection factor. And finally, the last thing I wanted to bring onto the table is this idea that all profits are not created equal. This is actually not my idea. This is from a Harvard Business School paper, and it's also discussed in a documentary, movie documentary that I highly recommend, and you can find on YouTube, which is called The Real Value. And in this paper, what the authors, the writer says, was that there is a new way of thinking about how business can serve. The old way is philanthropy. Philanthropy is sharing wealth that has already been created. But a better way of creating wealth is by serving. And when I say that, it's creating a profitable business that does good. And they coined this phrase that says, all profits are not created equal. Those that carry a social benefit are better. If you're an investor, and this is just the last questions I throw to the audience, if you're an investor, why wouldn't you invest in a company that returns adequate rewards to you, but also does good? If you look for a business, or if you look for a fund that does good, in addition to return shareholders, why would you invest in that fund? But here's the rub. If you're a business leader and you are competing for capital, why wouldn't you choose a business model that does good in addition to reward shareholders? So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and hope you.
So thank you, Juan. I think if you're not already convinced about investing in ESG funds, now we are definitely convinced. Actually, mentioned one of the topics that you mentioned was the population growth, and I saw the graph the other day. It's quite remarkable. Like it just entered like exponential growth over the past 20 years. Is something that was growing like this and suddenly jumped, and make us think like, probably we have to change the way we live, or maybe find another planet like Elon Musk is trying to find. I don't know. Well, our next speaker comes from the Nordea Asset Management. She's the head of ESG marketing communications. She is a certified ESG analyst, but from our competitors, but that's okay. That's okay. And she's also she has an MSc in economics and business administration. and we are very pleased to welcome her to the stage.
It's a bit tricky with earrings for women. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde, or hyvää iltapäivää, as we would say in Finnish. My name is Suvi Saari. I'm the head of ESG marketing and communications at Nordea Asset Management. And I'm actually quite excited to be here today to talk to you about active ownership and engagement. And I'm giving you now a quick look into the kind of the machine room of active ownership at Nordea Asset Management. So further ado, where do I point this? No. Now, yes. So first, I think I should define what is active ownership. Basically, and it's in its simplicity, active ownership is the use of ownership rights and position to influence the behavior and actions of our investee companies. Generally, there has been seen, and also how we see it at Nordea Asset Management, there are two ways of doing it: engagement and voting. The recent trend that we see in that space is that these two actions are moving closer together, and they're really supporting each other in the active ownership activities. Then, why is active ownership important? Why should we be doing it? At Nordea, we see three basic reasons to do this. So first of all, to protect shareholder value, to enhance long-term returns, and increasingly, and very importantly, to foster the positive change. And what do I mean by fostering positive change? I mean making sure that in our investee companies take responsibility of their actions, of their impact on the society at large. So this is basically the real world impact that we look for in our engagement and active ownership activities. Then how does active ownership fit into Nordea's responsible investment framework? Basically, it's one of the key pillars of our corporate level responsible investment overlays. So this means that all these overlays we apply to all of our funds, and therefore we engage with any holding where we see the need to do so. Then looking into how we've arranged ourselves to do this, how we've arranged our resources to do this. First of all, I'd like to say that this is not done in some silo. This is a collaborative action throughout the organization. Of course, we have some key, identified some teams that are key factors in doing active ownership. First of them being our responsible investments team. So alongside with the ESG analysis that they do, they also maintain an overview of our active ownership activities, also on our active ownership approach, our policies, and they really go in there to the field, put their hands into the mud, and they engage with companies. Then they obviously work closely together with our investment teams. So our portfolio managers are also actively participating in active ownership activities, especially in engagements. They also participate in our engagements. They go there with our ESG analysts and meet the companies and have the dialogue with the companies. Then the third team is corporate governance team, and they are basically the point of contact for any governance related issues at Nordea. They are also taking care of our voting activities, and especially there, they have to be communicating to the investment teams as well as to the responsible investment team, who has very crucial role in giving the input for, especially when there's environmental or social topics to be voted at. So by collaborating, these three teams, they execute our active ownership activities through engagement and voting. Then if we look at a bit closer engagement, there are two ways we've identified in doing it. So there's collaborative engagement, meaning that we join forces with other investors to enforce our message and to highlight the importance of it in the engagement. Then we have individual engagement, which obviously means that we as Nordea, we engage directly with our investee company and establish a direct dialogue with them. So these are the two ways to engage. Then we've identified three different types of engagement as well. These are obviously just to kind of clarify what kind of engagement can be, but engagement don't necessarily fall into one bucket only. They can be a little bit overlapping between these types. But just to go to the types, the first one would be norms and incident-based engagement. This is more of a reactive type of engagement, and we basically engage with companies where we see that they are breaching or potentially breaching international norms or conventions, or we engage with companies that are facing severe ESG-related incidents, for example. And why do we do that? We want to ensure that the breach or the incident that has happened is being handled properly by the company, but also that the management of these type of ESG risks is being improved going forward. Then the second type is investment-led engagement. This is a proactive way of engaging. It's mainly driven by our ESG analysis. And this is something where our portfolio managers especially have a very important role. So portfolio managers engage with companies on the material ESG risks that they have identified. And by material ESG risks, I obviously mean ESG risks that have or could have financial impact on the company. Then the last type of engagement, certainly not the least, also a proactive type of engagement is the thematic engagement. We at Nordea, we have identified sustainability thematic focus areas for our engagement that they guide our engagement. Where do we focus, which kind of companies we engage with? But I'm going to come to those a bit later, because first I want to tell you how have we defined, or what kind of process we have defined for our engagement. First of all, engagement process should always start with engagement selection. So obviously we don't have the resources to engage with every company on every possible ESG topic. So we really need to focus which companies we need to engage with and what is the topic we need to address. When that has been clarified, we need to make an engagement plan. What is the way to engage with this company? What kind of tools can we use there? What type of engagement should this be? But also we need to set objectives, not only for us, but also for us to be able to really communicate to the companies what are the expectations that we have. Also, it helps us ourselves, of course, to measure the progress of the engagement going forward. When plan has been set, we need to continue our research on the ESG topics and on the company, but also to establish the dialogue with the company. We can do this by setting up meetings. We normally do field trips as well. Of course, now with the pandemic, that has not been possible, but will be back in the agenda. But normally this is not something you can do overnight. Engagements, usually they run over 2 to 5 year period. I'd say in average 3-year period. So this is something ongoing. The dialogue has to be ongoing and sustainable for a long time. Then finally, we obviously need to report on progress if there has been any. Maybe there has been progress that we can report, or maybe we can close out the engagement as a successfully achieved engagement. well, perhaps there is not always progress. It could be that the companies are not responding to us the way we want them to, or there hasn't been sufficient actions. And in that case, we need to escalate the engagement. One way of escalating an engagement is doing it through our voting. Voting can be a very useful tool in that sense. We can express our view again in the annual general meetings and vote on these topics. Another way of escalating could be freezing the assets, putting the company in quarantine while we need to investigate further. What is the situation? Why is the company not proceeding? But finally, and maybe the last resource escalation tool is divestment from the company. And we do say that that's the last resource because engagement is always, always, always our preferred approach. Obviously, I need to say here that for investors to have a meaningful engagement with the company, they also need to be prepared to divest from the company. That gives the engagement the real credibility, even though it would be the last opportunity to use, that still needs to be in the toolbox. Then, as I promised, I'm getting back to the thematic engagement focus areas. So we at Nordea, we have defined 4 different focus areas that guide our focus in engagement and also to choose which topics to address. First of them being climate. This is obviously something that has been a long-term focus for us. We, as investor, obviously we want to reduce the climate-related risk from our portfolios, but we also have ambition to align our portfolios with the Paris Agreement over time. So this is something that we need to talk to the companies if we want to achieve this. We cannot just divest and say that's it. We don't want to pass the ball to another one. We want to get rid of these emissions, and that's why we need to engage on this topic. Then human rights, also a long-term focus for us and will continue being so in the future. It will stay relevant. There's actually some emerging regulation in some of the European countries around this topic. So this is definitely something we will keep on focusing. Then we have good governance, and we think that with good governance practices, it's also easier to build on management of other ESG-related risks and opportunities. There are obviously many different subtopics to these themes, but for example, for good governance, one of the focus points for us is board diversity, and we really aim to achieve 40-60 gender representation in the boards of the companies we invest in. And finally, we have water and biodiversity focus area. Water is something that has also been our long-term engagement focus topic, but and also obviously because it's a scarce resource and will continue being so. So it will definitely stay as one of our focus areas. However, biodiversity is a more recent addition to this. It's new, but it's obviously important. Especially important and also difficult because it doesn't have clear ways of measuring what is the company's impact on biodiversity. For example, if we look at climate, where we have a lot of tools to measure our climate risk, the emissions and so on, there isn't really so much tools to use for the biodiversity. So it makes it even more important that we talk to the companies about this issue. So these are the four focus areas, and I've added some SDGs there because I think these are clearly supported by international initiatives and international frameworks such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals and can be linked directly to specific SDGs, but also more recent proof point that these are not just some randomly or conveniently selected focus areas comes from the new regulation So in the table, I've put there the principal adverse impact indicators that we are to measure and report on going forward. So I've made some color mapping there as well, and these 14 mandatory corporate indicators can all be fit into our thematic focus areas. So another proof point that this really supports what we do. Then when we are talking about thematic engagements, I'm going to give you one very interesting example from the field as well. This is a climate-themed engagement. It's a collaborative engagement against the construction of Vung Ang 2, which is a coal-fired power plant situated in Vietnam. Why is this climate related? Well, obviously it's a coal-fired power plant, and coal currently contributes to global warming. It's the largest contributor to global warming actually at the moment. And therefore coal power must be phased out globally by 2040 if we are to limit the global warming to 1.5 Celsius degrees. Obviously, coal power as it's already something that we view negatively, but Vung An 2 unfortunately has even significantly higher emissions than if we compare to limits applied elsewhere in the world. If we compare to other coal-fired power plants. So this is very unfortunate, and this is why we needed to raise our voice. And more to come. This Vung An 2 is planned to be built on the same site as where we already have the Vung An 1 plant. And Vung An 1 has already faced a lot of controversies around environmental and social topics. There has been detected environmental pollution in the area, and also local society has faced some health issues due to this plant. So Vung An 2 would be built on the same site, so obviously the view is not very positive there. And in addition to these environmental and social controversies, the Vung An 2 is not, or is also questionable from a financial point of view. Carbon Tracker is a think tank, and they estimated that by 2022, which is next year, cost of constructing renewable energies will be lower than operating costs of already existing coal power. So we might think, why would we build this? Well, what does it matter for Nordea? In order to meet climate targets and to execute our ambition to align our portfolios with the Paris Agreement, we need to phase out coal from our investment universe. It's simple as that. But instead of divesting, we need to talk to the companies, we need to engage on this topic. As I mentioned before, we don't want to pass the ball to the next one. We want to get rid of these emissions from our atmosphere. And that's why we put together a collaborative engagement. Nordea was the initiator of it. We managed to gather 25 investors that are representing roughly 4.8 trillion euros in assets under management. So it's a rather significant group that is demanding this. So what did this group do? We sent a letter to start with, addressed to the companies that are associated with this construction project of Vung An 2. This letter, obviously, it highlighted all these environmental and social controversies that we've already detected, but it also urged these companies to not only withdraw from this Vung An 2 project, but also to exit coal, the whole coal industry. After sending the letter, we've followed up with the companies, we've had meetings with the companies, and we've discussed the topic with them. And that has been a great chance for us to also enforce our message on this topic. This engagement was initiated last year. And as I mentioned before, normally engagements run from 2 to 5 years, on average 3. So this is basically in its infancy if we compare to normal engagements. However, we've already gotten very concrete outcomes from this engagement. Perhaps it's also partially because of the extensive media coverage. Media really picked up our actions there, and they have helped us to form a public opinion against the construction project. Some of the highlights maybe from the responses from the companies. This work carried out by the investor group has contributed to multiple companies that we contacted, announcing an end to coal projects going forward. So that's a significant win. On the other hand, we also have China, Japan, and South Korea, which are representing obviously those state-owned companies that we approached to. They have also made net zero commitments just a few months after we started this engagement. And in some of those parliament meetings, it was actually referred to growing investor pressure on this topic. So I think we can say we've achieved a lot with this fairly new engagement already, and we are really excited to see where can it take us. Maybe a cherry on top of the cake. This engagement has been shortlisted for the 2021 PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment Award. It has been selected as the finalist for Stewardship Initiative of the Year. And as you may know, PRI is the initiative in the responsible investment space, and PRI award obviously being the award of the year. So this is a great recognition for us, and we're really proud of having this support from PRI. But that was my concrete example of what is thematic engagement. We looked into a little bit of what we do in Nordea in terms of active ownership as well as engagements. So I hope you found it interesting. I hope you got some inspiration from it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for such an insightful presentation. Actually, I think I forgot to mention your name, didn't I? Sorry, I was focused on a joke about your certificate and I forgot your name. So the speaker was Suvi Cristina Sari, and I hope I pronounced it correctly. Thank you again for the insightful presentation with a very good example, and how engagement can change things. Our next speaker is Arnaud Baudin, is currently a portfolio manager at OFI Asset Management. Is actually the fund manager of OFI RS Equity Climate Change. Before that, he worked as a European large caps analyst before moving to BNP Paribas, where he started a career in wealth management. He has a master's degree in private law and a postgraduate degree in international finance and taxation. So let's welcome Arnaud Baudin.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. So I'm a portfolio manager, and so I'm using ESG. And to start, yes. So I'm portfolio manager at OFI. OFI is a key player in SRI. It's really active and committed, part of many initiatives. And myself, I'm very happy with the statistics given by Klaus a couple of minutes ago, because I'm not a millennial. I'm part of a generation that is a bit older. And I'm very happy to understand that now more than 50% of people of this tranche of age want to express personal values or invest in companies with positive impact. So this is great news. This is not something that is only for millennials. It's getting mainstream. Yes, so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes to talk to you about the global warming, to convince you that it's an investment perspective, and then we will tell you how we are doing it in this fund. So climate is, when we are talking about climate, we're talking about the very long time, and what we have seen is that in the recent decades, the situation has shown an outstanding acceleration in temperatures, and of this long-term phenomenon, the climate is changing, and it has already changed in the past, million years ago, and now we are seeing it because we are part of it. We are part of it because we are going to live this warming, and we are responsible for it. One of the starting point is the way we are consuming. We are consuming way too much, and this is due to the growth in population, the rising needs and aspirations that Juan talked about, and due also to reduce poverty. But converging consumption patterns, like more meat, more energy, is not sustainable, as most resources are constrained. So overconsumption endangers large parts of biodiversity, and it coincides with the acceleration of temperatures of the last decades. So we put our existence at risk. This picture shows that mankind stands right at the top of this construction pyramid. And we are depending on millions of living species. And if we destroy parts of biodiversity, we put our existence at risk. Or at least it will require from us to adapt in a spectacular way. What do we fear? These are things that are getting from the World Forum initiatives, and they have some statistics showing that people are most afraid of the climate change. And we at OFI, as sustainable investors, we are addressing the most material issues that companies are facing when we are analyzing them. So climate change is a strong, multi-decade mega trend with financial implications. And as financial implications, we mean risks and opportunities. The risks, they are physical, and there is a risk from transition. And this is for corporates. You see on the top and on top left, the physical risks. This is all the endlines that we are seeing in the news. Transition risks, they are starting to appear, and we have seen that the carbon price has soared in the last months. This is representative of the importance it gets now. And you can also see that on valuation of companies, the best example is oil majors. Valuation are only going down. It means that we are starting to price the transition risk for these companies. And this is why for the last 2 years, those companies have changed a lot their speeches and their ambitions and their strategies. Now they are embedding the climate change into their strategies. So what do we need to do? We need to cut emissions, not only the intensity of emissions, but emissions themselves. And you see on this chart that the size of the challenge. And what we have to understand is that the longer we wait, the tougher the change required will be. It will be very hard to swallow, and also it will be more expensive for it to happen. What should we change? What should we change? We have to reduce our emissions. So we have to start with the carbon-intensive sectors: energy, transportation, and building. For that to happen, we have to change processes. We have to decarbonize the processes. So we need to move to low carbon modalities in transportation. We have to move for new solutions. Technology is here to help, but we have to put a lot of investment, a lot of money into the system in order to make this transition happen. This is why public money is coming to that. And we can imagine that for the coming years, decades, it's going to be trillions of dollars year after year. What does it mean? It means that this is representing great opportunities for business, for the companies that are involved into these markets. And companies that will not adapt will have probably to disappear. This slide is just an illustration of the supranational level of action. It's up to everyone to act. No one is too nimble from all sides, you know, everyday life, but also for corporates, countries that set the scene, and for the supranational organization that put money and start the regulation. One element of this slide is the taxonomy. Taxonomy is very important because it will give some standards. It will help assess the green businesses and the business that will help and that will be eligible for taxonomy, etc. in the reporting that comes. And the financial world is really part of it because this is where the money comes from. And it will help engage with companies to disclose more, to disclose their participation to that transition. It's going to be live next year, so it will help. So, to sum up, climate change is a multi-decade megatrend. It bears risks and opportunities for companies. And as such, it's of course an investment thematic for the long run and not for quarters. As a consequence for us, investors, we cannot afford overlooking that in our investment cases, the alignment or not of a company when we look at the trajectory that is required for the Paris Agreement. So this is our conviction, and we are taking that into account into our processes in order to build a portfolio that is sustainable. So how to deal with climate change in an equity portfolio? So this is really my day-to-day business. So our investment our investment philosophy is twofold. It's extra financial and financial. Of course, since 2009, this fund has been recognized for embedding ESG into its investment process. So we believe it enriches our analysis of companies, and history shows it paid off. And since 2016, the extra financial selectivity has been augmented by our dedicated methodology to analyze the carbon strategies and the transition strategies of companies. So we look for involved companies at their own level, because all companies are not exposed to in the same magnitude. And we invest in companies, of course, that will have solid prospects for growth and value creation, because it's the way to build portfolios in order to make your money thrive. These are the companies in which we invest. So we invest in companies that are highly exposed to carbon emissions, and we invest in companies that decarbonize their high exposure. Second, we invest in also companies that tackle their exposure to environmental issues and opportunities. And this is for all companies that are not so carbon intensive. We look, of course, at ESG practices, and we look at the financial angle. This makes us having a portfolio that is well diversified and that is not only exposed to companies that bring solutions to the rest of the world. So what are the carbon intensive industries on which we focus on the carbon footprint and the transition strategy? Those sectors, there are 8, and they comprise roughly 90% of the stock 600 emissions, but they only represent 27% of its market cap. So you see that for those, for the companies that belong to those sectors, it's a key material issue. And that's what we like to look at OFI. For those sectors, we have built a matrix that is analyzing both quantitatively and qualitatively the strategy of those companies. On one axis, we look at the current standing of companies, looking at their current emissions and their current intensity of emissions, and we can rank companies within their sectors depending on the intensity of their business. And as much as we can, we look at the physical unit emissions. So it makes us able to rank companies from the worst to the best in terms of emission. And on the other axis, we look at the strategy of this company, because those companies need to address their carbon footprint in the future, and they need to cut and to align to the Paris Agreement. So for those that emit, they have to find solutions, and they have to build a strategy with ambition, targets, incentives, etc., and even developing green products or solutions in order to be considered for us as strong opportunities, which is the kind of ground. It's the companies that emit less and that bring and that have very convincing strategies. So, but we have talked only of roughly 30% of our universe, and we need to address the rest, because we don't just want to build a portfolio that is on this limited part of the universe. So for the rest, we look at the environmental issues, and for them, we are going to look at what they are doing, what are their practices, what are their strategies, what are the results that they can have from that. And this is obvious to look at that, because when we are talking about the climate change, we are not talking only about the energy transition, we are also talking about the environment, the ecological transition, and we are looking at different aspects that needs to be tackled, meaning water resources, natural resources, water, waste management, etc. So these are elements that are part of the equation, and for some companies that just consume electricity and that try and supply energy from green sources, they also need to address the packaging issues, etc., the water pollution, all those elements, in order to be sustainable and to address the trajectory. So here we are. So there are companies that transform themselves because they are emitting a lot, and their future is to emit less or even nothing. There are companies that have very good practices and in terms of environment, and you have also companies. You can see some examples on that slide of enablers for the transition. So it means companies that bring solutions to their customers for all participants of this world to be more aligned with the trajectory that we all need to achieve. So for those companies, they can belong to any sector, any industry. We can find a lot, of course, in technology. On this slide, I just put as an example Dassault Systèmes that is helping its customers to improve efficiency in manufacturing process, etc. So in cities, in infrastructures, even in life science, and this way, those companies can manage the life cycle of their products, and they can improve a lot the efficiency. You have Neste in the oil and gas industry. Neste is a refiner, but it's a refiner that is transforming towards products that will help decarbonize, because they refine biofuels. And what they do as a leader in the world is to develop those biofuels from resources that are not in conflict with food supply. So this is great. you have other examples like Kingspan that develop materials to improve the building insulation of the developed products for the building insulation. We have talked about energy. We can talk about of transportation, but also of building, because a lot of emissions are coming from building, and they need to improve the efficiency for cooling or warming these buildings. Siemens Gamesa is kind of obvious because it's wind turbines, and wind turbines are required in order to produce green electricity. And Johnson Matthey is another example. This is for the car makers, because in addition to helping clean the air from the engines, they also produce materials for the electric batteries. So you see that we have a broad spectrum of companies within the portfolio. We don't want to be on a niche, because we believe that the transition is the matter of everyone, as individuals, as corporates. And we need to invest in all those companies and not just focus on some of them. Recent history showed us that we can be subject to bubbles, and renewable bubble. There's been kind of a renewable bubble with outstanding performance last year. This year it's more complicated for that. So managing the problem at the broad level and not just with one solution or two is much better from an investment point of view. And this is why we have this comprehensive approach. So to conclude, everyone has to act, of course. We prefer the diversified approach. We look at everybody, and we can see that this is the best way to accompany the transition, and because we need to accompany the companies that are transitioning, rather than just supporting the companies that bring the solutions. And this is also a way to differentiate from a portfolio that is just looking for a low carb footprint. So of course, we are going to invest in companies that emit greenhouse gases, but they are going to emit less in the future. So this is the best way to support the transition. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you again, Arnaud, for the presentation. Our next speaker has a very extensive resume. She has 24 years of career experience. Let's not exaggerate. She's the founder and partner of a consultancy firm focused on sustainability, and she has worked in many places. She has worked in Merrill Lynch. She has worked at NGOs, new agencies, at the National Statistics Institute. She also for the Pulp and Paper Industries Association, the Portuguese one. She has an undergrad, a master's, a PhD, and currently she lectures or she coordinates a couple of classes on sustainability here at ESG. She's also the consultant for the UN Green Climate Fund for the region of Africa. And let me say one more. She's a member of the investment committee for the investment committee fund for social innovation in Portugal. So let's welcome Sophia. Let's welcome Sophia Sanches. Thank you very much.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And we are just before the roundtable. We have been in this room for quite a long time. So my job is to do a global vision of what was said. And we always have the same problem. Aha, pressing the wrong button. So, so what we have, I just like to recall why we are talking about ESG, because sometimes it feels like we are talking about the same financial, that there is this temptation about ESG, in which we end up talking about ESG just as if we were talking about derivatives, or just as if we were talking about some financial new trends, new financial product that someone created, and therefore let's go for it. So I would like to go back and remind us that why ESG issues are necessary, but that no one is obliged to go on that direction. It's up to organizations to decide if it makes business sense for the financial institutions to provide with ESG projects or products, and the same with companies. There is, well, okay, we do have a strong regulation, environmental regulation in some sectors, but you know, at least in the financial sector, we also have regulations, but they don't say that banks or that financial or that investment funds must be green. Okay, so I think that's something relevant on this. And why is that? Because actually, I think we can't force the market to do things, because either we want a market economy or we want a centralized economy. And therefore, the government and the regulators, they are able to set up frameworks that can induce behavior. And that's what is taking place now. So European Commission is putting some frameworks that can induce financial system players towards one or the other direction. But I don't think we can expect any central bank or any financial authority to say every bank now cannot lend money to fossil fuel industries. I'm not expecting that to happen. It's up to the organization to decide what makes strategic sense. So, and why does it make strategic sense to do this? I think that's the key point that we want to prove. We want to basically induce and hopefully every single player in the market will understand that going into this direction is something positive for their business. And it's much better to go into the ESG world than not going, but nevertheless, it's up to each organization. So the reason why we are talking about this today in 2021, well, it's because we forgot a lot of things. We as economists and financiers, we like to see numbers going up, and we always like GDP, to see GDP going up. And this is the GDP we have from a long time. And you can see the world GDP, and we can see that from 1950, the GDP just went up exponentially. And of course, as any analyst, if you saw this chart, what type of questions would you raise? Lots of questions. First of all, if the data was correct, right? Did someone put extra zeros where it shouldn't be? What made this go up so quickly? Will this go up forever? Probably not, you would doubt. But somehow we as economists and financiers, we believe that this will go up forever. Okay, so imagine that chart. Do you think that chart will actually go up forever? Any chart like that. So, and still there is this reluctance in talking about not growing as much in terms of GDP, but being able to actually develop in other areas and therefore be able to create health and jobs and economic activity. So economic activity is not the same as GDP growth, because at least healthy economic activity is not the same as GDP growth, because that GDP growth also led to an increase in the number of other variables that we as economists are not used to look at, which are the environmental variables. So as you could see on that chart, we do have also some exponential growth in different variables, right, after 1950s. So
we forgot that. We forgot that some of the consequences of increasing GDP was also increasing some of the environmental variables of the planet that allow us to live the way we do. With those variables imbalanced, we might not be able to live the way we do, and the economic might not continue to grow as it has done in the past. All of us know that this has been leading to major climate-related events and major environmental disasters with financial costs and financial consequences. And basically, it's because of that the financial system is here talking about this, because finally, environmental issues, we are reaching such a we are reaching such a point that environmental issues are connected with financial damages as well. That's the only reason why the finance world is now talking about ESG, because it means money. Either you lose it, or you keep it, or you are able to get it a little bit more. The reason why the European Commission, for instance, is moving so fast in terms of the regulation is because we actually don't have that much time in terms of implementing all of this in order to put the money towards more environmentally friendly activities, because if the world temperature goes above 1.5 degrees, scientists will have some kind of difficulties in understanding the pattern of climate. So in some circumstances, we don't know if the storm is coming to Portugal, but we don't know if it's going to hit either the south, the center, or the north, and therefore the country is not going to create resilience in all of those places, and we will have physical and personal injuries and damages. So that's why, and I always like to give this science. I'm an economist, and of course, you know, I don't know how to speak as a scientist. But I think that most of us as economists and financiers, we really don't get the science. And the science has been telling us over the last 20, 25 years that this moment was going to happen. And we somehow thought that it was not going to happen, and it is. And at the moment in the Mediterranean, so where we are now, the temperature has already gone up 1.5 degrees. Okay, and the temperature around the world has gone up already 1 degree. And the goal of what we are always talking here, being carbon aligned and carbon neutrality in Paris aligned, is the world temperature, is so that the world temperature doesn't go up more than 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. So by the end of the century, you cannot go up then 1.5. In the Mediterranean area where we already are at 1.5, and the world is up 1.5, which means that we need to be really, really clever so that the world temperature doesn't go up another 0.5 until the end of the century. Because if it does, we will have many more disasters, environmental disasters, as we have been seeing over the last months all over the world. And that will imply financial and human damages. So this is, it sounds common sense, right? So it has taken so long to talk about this issue? Well, because, you know, we never realized that climate had an impact on companies. We're always, we were kind of aware that companies had some kind of impact on the environment, and that's where we developed the externalities concept, right? But we were never really aware that environment also has an impact on companies. And this is where we are now. We finally realized that the environmental aspect, the environment issues also impact companies. And that was given, this relation was provided actually by bankers, by the Financial Stability Board, when they produced...
Aqui, tem que estar aqui. Oh, meu Deus, ok. Detesto púlpitos e estas coisas. Para a próxima vou pedir o microfone na lapela. Mas está, eu porto-me bem. So what happened was that actually it was the Financial Stability Board that identified, as already referred, the impacts that climate can have on companies. So now we have words and we have a method. Ah, sim.
So So now we have words and we have a method about that can explain how environmental issues can also impact companies. And because of that, we are able to analyze companies and see how they are going to be, or how they are preparing themselves to be more resilient to those impacts. And this is a very intense slide, and of course it's not supposed for you to read, but just to be aware that this is what the Financial Stability Board expects every single company, including banks and fund managers, to provide in terms of information about how they are preparing themselves to continue their business under climate change. So, and this means that we need to have information about governance strategy, risks, targets. Every single company should calculate CO2 emissions scope 1, 2, and 3, including banks and including the investment funds. Of course, most of us from economy, we don't really know what is CO2 emissions scope 1, 2, and 3, but any student from engineering does that quite easily with an Excel file. So we must move on towards that direction. And as it was already referred here, greenwashing is a temptation. I think that if the financial sector was not that keen on this topic over the last 20 years, only recently, maybe the last 10 to 5 years, the issue became so trendy. There is this temptation, it's natural, there is this temptation for greenwashing. And so what the European Commission did was trying to avoid greenwashing in terms of the financial products. And then one of the main regulations that was already here referred as well is this Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, in which investment funds, even private equities and venture capital, we need to report a set of information so that they need to report information expressing how they are, if their funds are green or not. But of course, one of the possibilities is to say, well, my funds do not have any kind of environmental criteria, and that is complying with the regulation. Under this regulation, investment funds, they need to disclose information about the organization itself, so at entity level, policies, how do you include ESG risks into your investment policy, into your compensation approach as well with your employees, and also at product level. And here at product level, you're supposed to, if you have any kind of sustainability related fund, then you should be able to say if it's one or the other. So if it is a fund that promotes social and environmental characteristics, and it is defined, or if it's a fund that pursues sustainable investment, that has a sustainable investment goal. Okay, so this is a way of trying to avoid everyone saying that all my funds are green. I've heard in Portugal some institutions saying all of my funds are green, are sustainable, and you just cannot say that. Just for the sake of it. So what we have is a strict definition, maybe it's too strict, but it is a way to avoid having organizations saying that all my funds are green because I've signed some principles. Okay. Of course, these indicators are, today we know what type of indicators, as Nordea has expressed, what type of indicators investment funds will need to report. It's not a finalized list, but it should be soon at some stage with a delegated act by the European Commission. And okay, and it's about, as Nordea representative said, it's about well, 14 indicators and 9 environmental and 5 social, and they are not that difficult to respond. They are not so impossible to be actually implemented within the company, and then later on have some practical information. Some of the organizations that are already reporting using this type of indicators. And something that I think is also important to sum up this is the link between the requirements for reporting regarding the investment funds and the taxonomy. It's not the same thing, but it's important to be aware that at European level, we are having definitions about what sustainable environmental activities are, and so that we can tick the box, but it's not going to be an easy tick the box. But as we have just economic activities, we now have environmental sustainable activities. And that's a definition. There are definitions for that. And the main one is this one in this slide that basically says that any activity, in order to be considered as sustainable activity on the environmental aspect, the activity must contribute to at least one of those 6 environmental goals. So the activity itself must contribute to either mitigation, adaptation, protection of marine resources, circular economy, pollution, and ecosystem services, and cannot hardly damage any of the others. Okay, so imagine that you are looking at the investment in a company, and you, at some stage, you need to tag if that activity, if the activity of that company is or not aligned with this. So this is the type of rationale that needs to be done. And investment funds are also asked to say, they can say it's 0, okay? But they are asked to say how aligned investment funds are with the taxonomy. And I can say my fund is 0% aligned with the taxonomy. That is complying with the regulation. You just need to explain why you don't want, why you are not aligned. The same way that you need to say why you are aligned. So the criteria is just the same. And in order for a fund to be able to say the percentage of alignment with the taxonomy, well, you need to look at all of your investments, and you need to understand what is the turnover, OPEX and CAPEX of those investments that are aligned with the taxonomy, and then do the maths. It sounds easy. What happens is that many of the rating agencies are already working in providing this type of data, which means for large investment funds, this classification will probably be provided by rating agencies or data providers, mostly probably rating agencies. I'm not sure about this. But for those private equity funds, for instance, that don't have that type of information from raters, they need to calculate information. Okay, so a private equity fund needs to understand what is the turnover, CAPEX and OPEX of their investees. Of course, this also depends on the size of the fund in terms of when and if you really need to be obliged to report if you are aligned or not. But if a big portion of the market starts to report that it is aligned, even the smaller funds will also want to say so. But we still have the possibility that all the market says, well, I don't really care about this. So we have a regulation, but I'm not aligned. Okay, and so I think that's a possibility as well. So taxonomies, there's regulation, so very heavy documents around. The taxonomy applies to everything, not just the financial sector. It applies to large corporations as well. They have to say how they are aligned with the taxonomy, and also applies to the governmental and state aids, and applies to, it's not being approved, but theoretically it applies to every single funding, either from the European Commission or from each member state. Which means that many investments probably will be tricky to get the money if we really do analysis in terms of the taxonomy. So that's a challenge. And just to finalize the reporting, all of this needs to be reported because the financial market needs data and companies will need to report. There is this directive, a proposal for a new directive on corporate sustainability reporting, which will basically recognize the recommendations from the Financial Stability Board. So now this typical sustainability reporting will be much more demanding in strategical terms as well and in data. And another hot issue that is also coming up, it's about governance and about the duty of the board. And some studies have come out. One of them actually was a study for the European Commission, and that raised quite a lot of controversy because the conclusions, and of course those conclusions are not very kind of politically correct, because the conclusions are basically say that most of the boards, they don't have that knowledge, that much knowledge about sustainability, which means how can we eventually get and reach some political commitments that companies need to be part of it if the board members, they don't know about the topic. So this was a very polemical document, but it's not the only one. Several other research has been done in trying to understand the competencies and the skills of board members in terms of sustainability. And generally around the world, the conclusion is the same. The knowledge is very little. This is another research that says, well, so how can the board increase their knowledge? What can they do? And this is a list. Of course, I'm not going through the list. You can have access later on, but just for you to understand that there is quite a lot of debate about the governance, because as well, we are expecting a new directive in terms of governance for sustainability, where the duty of the board will most likely include the duty towards sustainability issues, medium, long-term stakeholders, and so on. And therefore, that's a completely new area in terms of management. I like this sentence because this was written in 2009, so quite a long time ago. But because I think sometimes we really have a misleading idea about what governance is. Governance is not about having, you know, a hierarchical chart and committees. It's not about that. It's actually about this, about leadership. What we have been talking about here is actually about a leadership that has some kind of ethical values and transparency, and that takes into account environmental and social issues, which is completely different from what we are used to hear about governance. Governance usually is dealt with the lawyers and with the very structured approach, but for that governance to make sense, it needs to be aligned with the vision and with the mission and with the purpose of the company. And most of the time that is missing, and some of these regulations are bringing that again into the conversation. Final takeaways. Well, you invest if you are willing to take some of these topics into consideration. You might be an investor that invests with some kind of responsibility. So you like to know where your money goes. And for that, there are different approaches. One of them is to have some kind of ESG screening, but there are many other criteria, many other approaches for me to decide where my money goes. And having an ESG investment policy can be more than just compliance as well. I think, at least in Portugal now, there is this very high concern about complying with the regulation, because it was out since 2019 and no one cared. And then suddenly it came into rule, and then everyone was scared. So everyone is concerned with compliance, but ESG is much more than just compliance. Well, it could be. It's up to the organization. It could be. In terms of strategic position, it can be seen as a strategic position where that organization want to be seen and want to evolve. Can be aligned with many other topics like the Sustainable Development Goals and carbon neutrality and Paris Agreement. But that's, as you see, suddenly it's another conversation. It's not just about ESG criteria. It's about the strategic approach and the purpose of the organization. And such alignment is related with the values and with the mission of the company. So therefore, you don't change your values and you don't change your mission and you don't change your culture every 2 years. So what I'm trying to say is that probably ESG issues to be incorporated into companies as a strategic matter, it will take some time because you can't really change things so fast. And just as a final sentence, nothing of this is obligatory. Your organization might decide that you still want to have your investment funds without any kind of alignment with that we are having here. So this is not an obligation, because sometimes people say, well, so nowadays European Commission has values in terms, are we running this economic system because of some values that some people have? No, it's up to the organization to decide what they want to do. And if it makes common sense, we are just creating a framework that allows us to see that there are other market economies that can grow and prosper. And it's up to the countries and up to each organization to understand if they feel that that's their road to go or not. And that's it for me. And thank you very much for listening. And I hope you still have energy for the roundtable. Okay.
Thank you again to Sofia Sanch. So the next, it's the roundtable. So I can call to the stage all participants. 4 of them you already know: Juan Fierro, Sofia Cristina Sari, Rita Oliveira Pinto, and Sofia Sanch. And then we also have Eric Van Labeck, and the moderator will be Miguel Rego. Eric Van Labeck is a senior SRI advisor at Offi Asset Management. He's an expert in the field and has been working in the SRI field since 2007. He has a long experience, having worked as a managing director of employee compensation solution companies, affiliates of banking and insurance groups. The moderator, like I mentioned, is Miguel Rego. He's actually a colleague of mine at CFA Society Portugal. He works as a head of analysis at Funds People Portugal. He's been working there for 7 years. He's a CFA shareholder, of course. And he also, before he started his career in asset management, in a family office as an investment analyst.
Many thanks, Miguel, for your presentation. We already heard a lot about sustainability, ESG, and SRI. We'll have a little bit more of conversation, trying to spark your discussion. And I'll start with Sofia, which has a warm voice. And we're talking about governance is something that is already embedded as a process for the environment has been focused most recent times, and protecting from light on the social part. What do you see changing and now in the future of future?
Well, we never know the future. Yes. Okay. So we really never know how the future will be, but so what I expect, well, in terms of the social aspects, the social taxonomy is already out for public consultation. What I'm trying to say is that at ESG, of course, environmental, social, and governance, and we need to define what this means. So the European Commission is working on a taxonomy for the environmental issues, for the social, and for the governance. I spoke about the environmental issues. and a little bit about the governance, and the social aspects are now also on the public domain. So it is in an open discussion now, a proposal for the social taxonomy. So what I would say is that definitely the social issues will be brought now. It is going to be, I think, more complicated than what people thought, because the existing draft of the social taxonomy is quite complex. It has a very academic rationale, and I think it's going to be, it has a point, but I think it's going to be a bit difficult for companies to deal with that. They will need to learn that logic. But I have no doubt that the social issues will come up much stronger than so far. I mean, it started by the environmental issues, because that's what as we saw in the numbers and everything, we need to act fast, and climate needs more time to adapt than people. If we want, we can change our behavior. But climate, if we want, climate takes time to change its behavior. So that's why environmental issues have come first.
In the end, climate is social also.
And at the end, climate is social, because if you go if you work in Africa and you see those people are those that are the least responsible for the CO2 emissions and climate change, and of course they are the ones that will be suffering the most, because even more dry, more storms, no food, and therefore climate risks also imply social problems, not only for the developing countries, but as well for us, because as we can see with some of the disasters recently, people suffer with that.
I'm sorry to you all, you have to share the two microphones you have, but it's your turn, it's your time, Rita. Also about the social aspect, you're an insider of the regulator. Tell me how do you see this pillar of ESG in the CMBM? I guess it's on.
So, as I mentioned, I think the social and the governance factors cannot be left behind, and we have to combine all three to get a succeed transition to a sustainable model. So I think these two factors are also very important, and I think we should have more scrutiny of some apparently sustainable models that, when I say apparently, because they seem to be nice companies, but they do not respect human rights, or they do not have the standards, minimum corporate governance as they should. We all are aware of, for example, of the fast clothing fashion, i.e. there is some clothes there we can buy at very inexpensive costs, but at last the costs lies with poor working conditions, lower age, and even childhood work. So I think we should have more scrutiny on this. I think also with internationalization and the fact that companies have in their value chains companies from abroad. So I think they have to know what the impact of their activity cause in the communities. And so I think it's very, very important that they do a careful due diligence at the end of the value chain to understand which are the practices that are being implemented in those participants of this value chain. I also say that it is a very good new that we have already being developed the social taxonomy that Sophia mentioned. I think the taxonomy is crucial for investors to know where they can invest in projects of companies that promote social impacts, that they contribute to have to communities have access to infrastructures and to have the minimum human rights they deserved. I think these have to be done with respecting at the same time the environmental safeguards. So we cannot look at the taxonomy only on the environment side or social side. We have to combine both, and we have, of course, not to forget the importance of the good corporate governance. I share with Sophia that the social taxonomy is has complex or even more complex than the environmental. It's not based on science, on contrary of the environmental taxonomy, but I think in metrics, in terms of metrics, it will be a challenge, a great challenge in terms of metrics. And also taking into account the diversity that we have in different regions, different communities. And so I think these also have an impact in terms of the social factor.
Eric, yes. We've talked a lot about the impact of regulation in the asset management and investment. What about the impact of the regulation on distribution of investment products?
Well, the impact would be considerable. The new regulation, disclosure, and the taxonomy have put a strong weight on the shoulders of the asset managers and the asset owners. Already there's been a considerable paperwork that has been done regarding the products and regarding all the obligations that were set by these two main pillars of the new regulation. The idea behind this is to avoid what has been said before, that is greenwashing. And why is it? It is because the main target for the new regulation is obviously the individual investors. Behind the institutional investors lie the idea that in order to achieve the very ambitious goals in terms of climate mitigation, we'll have to drive a huge amount of money, and this huge amount of money has to be found in the individual's pockets. So that is the first point. It is to avoid greenwashing, and there is already a considerable changes that has been made into the documentation that is given to the individual investors. We'll have another set of paperwork after the end of the year with the reportings that will be delivered. But this is only a starter, because the main game changer will be when the new MiFID and IDD regulations come into force. And this is likely to happen at the beginning of 2023, because the law was passed in 21. The ESMA will conduct an inquiry during Q4 2021. We'll have the consultation, and we know the Commission will issue its last report by mid-2022. So that means that the networks have 1 full year to get ready to have their clients answer the question that will be put under the new MiFID regulation, which is what are your preferences in terms of sustainability? And obviously the clients will be quite puzzled by this kind of questions. They're not very much accustomed to having this question put to them. And also the distribution networks will maybe be a little bit clumsy. So, I mean, we'll see how, starting 2010-23, we'll see how the networks respond to this new obligation, but it's going to be quite a game changer.
Sure. Suvi, what's your take on what's your take on this subject of investment distribution of investment products and the impact that regulation has on the distribution?
Well, I can obviously speak from Nordea Asset Management point of view. And what comes to fund flows, we've seen a clear shift towards ESG products, both Article 8 and Article 9 products. We've also seen increasing invest, especially towards thematic products, and especially those ones who address the S in ESG. Then another thing, once MiFID II comes into force in August 2022, the distributors will need to set their own sustainability preferences and obviously communicate those to us, the fund managers. So there we see that the bigger distributors will obviously have more power in demanding certain type of products that fit into their sustainability preferences. So smaller distributors will obviously not have the same power, and this will be the driving the demand over the next few years. That's our view. We also believe that despite that, that the distributors, they will have to set these sustainability preferences, we still think that there's space for both ESG funds and the traditional funds going forward. And that's how we're going to do it at Nordea. Maybe to add a tiny quote, yes, as well. We do see that this regulation can seem challenging for distributors and advisors, especially, and we've really seen that at Nordea. Therefore, we want to be there to help the distributors and advisors, and we want to help them to understand what are the requirements. We want to be the partner providing the sustainable solutions to them, and we already do. And we're also offering different type of education to advisors on this topic. So that's how it's affecting distribution in from our perspective.
Since you touched the subject of big versus small, we talked about distribution platforms. I asked Juan if he thinks that the regulation and the heavy reporting and heavy human resources that it demands is getting that the bigger companies get bigger and the smaller companies get less capabilities.
Well, yes, definitely. I think bigger companies, they have the resources. So obviously the trend that we are seeing on the demand for ESG is helping those big companies to do the investments and probably keep up with the demand or the pace of demand. I mean, from the Janus Henderson point of view, there is a clear evidence that we've been dedicating a lot of resources and investing on ESG resources. And for that, I mean, not just technology and data, because obviously technology and data, we had that before. We had access to, as I mentioned before, Sustainalytics, MSCI, or Vigeo, but we're investing in resources, mainly knowledge and people, because that's what we need at the moment. It's also important to highlight what my colleagues have said, is that I think going forward, we see there's a space for both traditional funds and ESG funds, but also it's important to say that within the ESG space, there will be cheaper versions compared to more active products, where obviously we'll need more resources. So definitely, yes, cost will increase. Bigger companies will have access to those resources and probably more money to invest.
Sophia, as was touched before several times, the quality of information is key. How do you address the challenge, or how could we address the challenge of being limited to the information that data providers and rating providers provide, and that those providers only have access to what's visible and what's measurable? How do we address this challenge?
First of all, it's already good that we have data providers to provide that information for some of the largest companies, and so I think that's really good, because then it would be much more complicated to do all of this. But yeah, but the majority of the companies in Europe, well, I think in Europe, the average of SMEs is about 50 something or 60% in Europe as an average, but in many countries, like in Portugal, is like 90%, which means that for some countries where we don't have so many large companies, the issue is what do you do being an investment fund or being a bank, because banks also have to comply with some of these topics that we are talking about. How are you going to get the data from SMEs, for instance? In some constituencies that might not be relevant for some funds, but from others, from other type of funds, it could be, but this is mainly a problem for the banks that lend money to SMEs, and the banks will also need to report how they are aligned with the taxonomy. So ideally, all of us as companies, even me in my micro company, I should be able to report my green turnover, CapEx and OpEx, because it's with those numbers that banks will be able to calculate the capital requirements. So if most of the companies are not able to report that information, which at the moment they are not, banks will estimate. And I think by doing that, the final result, if they do it properly, the final result will be not that positive, because the average does not have a good green outcome, which means that therefore maybe it's best for banks to get the data from the origin, which means asking every single client for this data, because this is the only way to get the good examples out. And it's because as a bank, you want to say that you have the good clients. And the only way to know is if the client gives you the data. Because if you go if you do a benchmark analysis, the good ones will be diluted into the general non-very good performance, and then you might have a less risky loan portfolio, but you don't know because you are using. So I think the key issue is how can we help companies, SMEs, and even the micro companies to be able to report this type of information. And I think even in the past, some European funding was available for innovation in processes, and this is just an innovation in the process. It is for any company being able to implement a reporting system, a ESG reporting system, for instance. It's just an innovation in the process, and for that, even in the past, there was money about co-finance on 70%. From the European money. So hopefully the next package that we already should have known something, but we still don't do, because it's the 21-27 package, and we are already getting to the end of the 21, should have money to promote digitalization, carbon neutrality, and circular economy. Therefore, this should be a core area for public funding. Let's see.
Can we get the microphone to Rita? Thank you. Rita, do you have any take on this quality of information subject, and what other challenges would you like to highlight?
So I think that information is key. So we have to have credible information, quality information, comparable information on the market. The banks and the asset managers and the companies are obliged to report that type of information, and they need this as a source the non-financial information from companies. What we have now in Europe is that Europe is leading, and we have already for some years the duty to disclose non-financial information. but the scope of companies that have to make such disclose is quite limited. We now the Commission is in course with a revision of this directive, and this will extend significantly the scope of companies that will be subject to this mandatory disclosure. In any way, there are the SMEs, there are non-listed SMEs, that this gap of information continues to exist. I think that such SMEs will be increasingly demanded from banks, and from this example that I give from companies that want to know what are the ESG factors incorporated in the companies of the value chain. So they will be increasingly demanded to report this type of information. This reporting, it's very complex. And so I think that it is important to have a proportional and simpler reporting model for SMEs to doing it in a voluntary basis. And these standards that are being developed at the European level for these companies that will be obliged to report also can be used by SMEs, and a more simplified model will be developed for them. So I think this will help them to report this type of information, because they will be demanded to do so. In any case, in my view, I think that companies, and I believe that companies will have to incorporate ESG factors in their business models to succeed at a long time. So they have to move the shift from shareholders to stakeholders. This will be key for their sustainability at long term. And so I think they should try to report this type of information, to incorporate these factors. It will be a long path, it will be difficult, but I think this is the way that it has to be taken.
Since you have the microphone, we're talking about public equities and bonds and even private assets. Do you see that this growing demand that you highlighted in your presentation for ESG or best-in-class assets, and I guess companies have to take a little bit more time to respond to that demand? Do you think that's having a big impact on valuations, and that's impacting maybe in the short term positively the portfolios, but in the long term maybe there's not that much room to grow?
Yeah, well, definitely when there is more demand than supply, we always have the risk of prices booming and obviously valuations going up, and more difficult for investors to find value. But as I was saying on my presentation, I think when we think about sustainable investing, we can either limit our universe to those best-in-class companies. We can just look and partner with companies through engagement, voting, to expand the universe. So obviously, when we think about active investing, I think that the best way to understand it, we think about two axes. One axis where we think about how risky that ESG or ESG factors that company have, and on the other axis we think about the trajectory. So what is the company doing to resolve those issues or those risks? So that way, through engagement and voting, we can work to expand the universe of companies that obviously are behaving on a more sustainable and yeah, on a social and environmental more friendly way. So yeah, obviously there is a risk, but I think we have to think bigger and try to work with companies to expand the universe.
Sure. Eric, do you agree with one?
Yes, I think there is there is a risk, a short-term risk that the green stocks spike very much and their valuation soars, and suddenly there is a sort of a bottleneck because everyone's trying to jump in the same train. Plus, if you think things over, if we want to achieve the climate goals, we'll have to multiply the electric vehicles production by a factor of 10. So this will put quite a stress on the supply chain. Now, on the other side, what you have to think, and I fully agree with what was said, you have to think a longer term and look at some risk that today is, in our opinion, poorly priced in the portfolios, and that is the climate risk. Whether physical and transition risk, overall transition risk, is absolutely underpriced in the portfolios, because the carbon price already only covers about I think something less than 25% of the global emissions. So you don't, I mean, the price of the air, the price of consuming the air is yet not at the level it should be. And if you think about climate change, you cannot think only about the price of the air, but also about the water consumption and the fact that the price of the water is already not where it should be. And the price of biodiversity is also absolutely out of the valuation of the portfolio. So yes, there is a risk, a short-term risk, that green stocks are overvalued, but there are higher risks, in our opinion, in the portfolios that lurk and have yet to be sorted out.
Sophia, should we not care about valuations for the greater good? Since you showed us the GDP graph.
Well, we should care about the correct valuations, and I think this is the time. This is an opportunity to improve on the evaluations of things. And this is not new. I mean, even the European Commission, maybe 15 years ago, started an activity beyond GDP, where they recognize that the GDP does not measure the real wealth of a country. And so GDP, it's outdated. It doesn't measure the prosperity of a country the same way that the profit and the turnover does not measure the real added value of a company to society. So I'm in favor of valuations as long as we value with the correct tools, and we include things that the market does not attribute a value, because the problem has been that we don't have a price for CO2 emissions. Let's put it that way. We have a price for a small niche of companies, large polluters, yes, but still a small niche in terms of the total amount of CO2 emissions. We don't have a market price, as Eric said, for biodiversity, and we don't have a market price for water, and so on. So and our economic model is only able so far to value things that the market is able to buy and to sell. And therefore we completely forget that there are many other assets that are not priced, but that allows us to buy bread at this price. If the ecosystem is not working, we will buy bread 10 times more. And therefore we need to value also all of that. So it's an opportunity to develop a new kind of accounting and a new type of GDP, and ESG can actually help quite a lot on these issues, because it's asking companies to calculate things that are not used to. So maybe at some stage countries will also be demanded, who knows, to, instead of just providing GDP, provide, you know, the value of the natural capital and the natural liabilities, provide the value of water resources and water scarcities and so on. This is the path we are actually going.
Keep the microphone. When talking a bit about greenwashing, and since recently with all the Article 8 and Article 9 classification, the impact funds came more into the spotlight. Where do you find true impact? Where do you find that maybe greenwashing is not the best word, because ESG is more than green, is ESG washing, as Rita said. Where do you find more ESG washing in the impact management fund space?
Well, me and Eric, we have been talking about this, so I think Eric will also help me on that. Impact investment is very different from ESG investing, and sometimes people confuse and they say it's the same thing, but it's not. ESG, as we've seen today, it's very objective in terms of, I'm going to screen my companies in terms of this type of criteria, and we never heard about impact today. So which means that ESG investment is different than impact investment. So impact investment is concerned about the impact and the outcomes and the changes in society that that investment will have. And therefore, impact investment is usually much more related with blended finance, or that includes philanthropy, for instance, or includes money from foundations that have as a nature also to create positive impact in society. So impact investment, it's more common in, for instance, developing countries. If you think that way, if you implement a solar panel in Africa, it has a much more impact than if you implement a solar panel in South Portugal, in terms of the impact, the change that you can make on people living around. So the impact also changes depending on the local, on the place where the investment is done. But I just wanted to make to make the point that ESG, of course, it also has an impact, but the focus is not on the impact of the money. The focus is on the criteria that we have to decide in which companies we are going to invest. Do you want to help me on this?
Please give us your input.
Yes, I do. The impact investing has a clear definition that was given by the World Bank. And in order to qualify as impact investing, you have to bring something that the day-to-day business wouldn't bring. That means the proceeds, the monies must go somewhere to fund a project, and you have to have the capacity to measure the impact and to report. So this is the strict definition of impact investing. Today the lines are a bit blurred because there was this fantastic ushering of the Sustainable Development Goals. And they suddenly sort of changed the landscape, because they were good looking, not like the Millennium Goals that they were replacing and that no one knew about. The Sustainable Development Goals just came after, but no one cared about them. And the idea behind this is, when you try to apply the impact investing definition to the large caps investing or the listed companies, you have to do it with the idea that you have to conduct a real thorough analysis beforehand in order to make sure that the impact that is given is really related to the business of the company you are financing. Otherwise, and this is where the line is a bit blurred, it's because you can easily fall into the charity business box. Okay, so really you have to be very much aware when you talk about impact investing. The green bonds are perfectly fitting into the box of the impact investing, because the proceeds are discriminated in the liabilities of the issuer, and you know where the money flows, it is directed, and you have a clear reporting on a project, and this is really impact investing.
Suvi, you talked about active ownership. Can there be impact investing without active ownership?
Yes, so maybe a word on active ownership there. So we do see that active ownership actually plays a crucial role in impact investing when we invest in public equities. Of course, that's not the traditional form of impact investing, but we see that if we need to have, or if to make impact, we need to do it in larger scale than in the traditional private equity illiquid space. We need to move towards the public equities, and that's where the active ownership is really crucial. We believe that active ownership, it really helps us to foster the change that I also spoke about earlier, to really generate the real world impact, just simply by helping companies to improve their day-to-day practices. So yeah, that's I think why active ownership is important.
Sure. Just to end, because we are already long on the time, a short answer from all of you, maybe start with Suvi so that you don't have to put the mask again. Where do you see the world of ISR or SRI, ESG investing, and in 10 years? If you'd be sit here in a round table in 10 years, what would we talk about?
So currently, we do know that there's a lot of innovation regulation happening in SRI and ESG space. So it's moving fast. It's very dynamic at the moment. So it's hard to also think to what kind of level we can reach in 10 years. But in general, I see two kind of movements going ahead. Integration of ESG risks is becoming will become more of a norm than what it is currently. So that would mean that portfolio managers, they need to work closer together with the ESG specialists, the ESG analysts. And this is actually something that we do at Nordea already. So we are very proud of our ESG Stars funds range. Our portfolio managers have a pair from the RI team and dedicated ESG analysts working on this. But however, I think this will become more of a norm going forward. Then quickly, I think we're seeing, as we already spoke about, there's a lot going on in the impact investing space, and we will see a shift, weight going to that space in the future. So more demand for impact investing, as well as more demand for really measurable impact KPIs.
Eric, your take on this 10 years horizon?
I absolutely agree with what has just been said. I think ESG will be swallowed by credit analysis. It will be really embedded in the risk, the portfolio measurement. We'll have more data, we'll have a better understanding, we'll have more transparency from companies, we'll have a better pricing for unpriced elements as of today, and this will facilitate and on the other hand, we'll still have this sort of active, demanding, society-based will that will probably be channeled through impact investing or through values investing. That's the way I see it.
Rita, your take.
Thank you. I would say that being optimistic, and I am by nature, it was a huge challenge, but we succeeded. in 10 years or in 10 years times, I would like to see that all companies will consider ESG factors in their business models, and then they will disclose, as they disclose their financial information, they will disclose sustainability information, and they will improve their practice. So
everything will be green.
yes, and also, no, it's not green. I think it's sustainable. It's a sustainable model. And also, I think, and I hope that investors that are interested in the returns will also want to invest for good. So it's not only for returns, it's also for good and to have a better world.
Juan.
Yes, I think I agree with my colleagues. I think in 10 years' time, I think ESG will dominate the investment universe. I will go a step back, and I think there's, as I mentioned in my presentation, there's a change in the consumer expectations and the consumer patterns, and there's also a change in the way investors will invest. And obviously that means that when companies fight for capital, they will obviously be required to meet certain criteria in terms of ESG. So in 10 years' time, probably we won't be talking about best in class, it will be more worst in class of the investment universe.
Sofia, to end the roundtable, what's your opinion?
Well, I think we will have standards, and for small companies, for micro companies, for SMEs, and for large. And we'll also have standards for smaller banks, medium banks, and large banks, and the same for from the investment funds. Standards will be growing from the European Commission. Data will be more available as well, hopefully publicly available somehow. It must be, in a way, some. But I think we will have two types of worlds. So a part of the financial system will comply with the regulation, and we'll disclose. We'll want to have some greening products, and we'll disclose that. But as has been said here, probably we'll also sell other non-ESG financial products at the same time. And probably we will see some organizations that will only sell ESG issues, ESG products, or greener and sustainable financial products. Probably these ones will be smaller, and I would expect the largest organizations to continue to sell both the green and the non-green, and the smallest one will just sell the sustainable approach.
Many thanks to all that contributed to the roundtable. Many thanks to all that kept here to the end, and to CFA Society. And so I guess we'll end here, and bye-bye.